Let us talk about the January 2026 OECD publication on permanent safe harbors and the side-by-side package between the inclusive framework, quote unquote, and the US. Most of the package concerns the permanent safe harbors. 11 out of 88 pages concern the side-by-side agreement. And I want to talk about the side-by-side agreement, but I want to put it into perspective. And so I pull in also the OECD corporate tax statistics from 2025, which shows the country-by-country reporting statistics from 2022 and how many MNEs in the world are filing CbCRs. What I'm trying to establish is how many CbCR filing MNEs will be affected by the OECD side-by-side package. Do not worry if you cannot read the numbers. We go into this in more details in the next slide, and I also leave a link to the OECD page in the next slides. If you look at the table on the right, you'll see a breakdown of the MNEs by region for periods from 2016 to 22. I think these numbers are interesting because they show how many more MNEs are in scope today compared to 2016, which is due to a number of factors, including the growth of the world economy. Now, for the Americas, there were 2,672 MNEs headquartered in the Americas in 2022, out of a total of 8,323. So we're talking about a little more than a quarter of the MNEs in the Americas. But now the question is, are all these MNEs or most of them in the US? Because these are the ones that will be benefiting from the side-by-side system. The short answer is no, as you can see from the breakdown by country, and I assume that this is reasonably accurate. Out of the 2,672 MNEs, almost 2,000 are in the US, but there are a significant number in Canada, the Cayman Islands, Brazil, etc. And these numbers almost match up. There are also countries where you have surrogate parent filings, and I don't know how that mixes up the numbers here. But you can see if we take all these countries, we end up with a total of 2,656 instead of 2,672. So these numbers somehow overstate the Americas numbers by 84, and I'm not exactly sure why. And then purely out of interest, I've added China and India relative to Asia and Oceania, and you can see the Asia-Oceania numbers were 2,850 for 2022, out of which 805 were in China and 146 multinationals were headquartered in India. So why do I list these two? Because these are the two most obvious candidates, which may also benefit from a side-by-side system should they choose that. Time will tell. Let us look at what the side-by-side safe harbor is in a nutshell. 1. The top-up tax shall be deemed to be zero for the IIR and UTPR, in other words Pillar 2, if the CEs in the jurisdiction qualify for the side-by-side safe harbor. And they qualify if the UPE is in a qualified SbS jurisdiction, i.e. for now in the US. 2. Under the SbS Safe Harbour, the top-up tax in a joint venture in the MNE is also zero. 3. A qualified SbS jurisdiction A has an eligible domestic system, and we will look at what that means. B has an eligible worldwide tax system, and we'll look at what that is. C provides for a foreign tax credit for QDMTTs just as for any other creditable covered tax. And D enacted these tax systems before the 1st of January 2026, or the inclusive framework approved the system as a qualified SbS thereafter. So, an eligible domestic tax system has A. At least a 20% statutory nominal corporate tax rate, considering preferential adjustments and subnational corporate income taxes. Now, I don't know what preferential adjustments is supposed to mean, but I assume that subnational corporate income taxes include state taxes and municipal taxes or provincial taxes. B. A QDMTT or a corporate AMT, alternative minimum tax, at a nominal rate of at least 15%, and it applies to a substantial portion of the M&E income in the jurisdiction. I don't know why it shouldn't apply to all, but the text says a substantial. and C, no material risk that M&E groups will be subject to an effective tax rate on domestic operations below 15%. So if you have these three, you are an eligible domestic tax system. Now, in order to have an eligible worldwide tax system, you need a comprehensive tax regime on foreign income imposed on a broad base that 1. Includes active and passive income of foreign PEs and controlled foreign companies, and 2. Is only subject to limited income exclusions consistent with the policy objectives of a minimum taxation, such as, for instance, excluding high taxed income. Further, an eligible world tax system has to have B, incorporating substantial mechanisms to address BEPS risks, and C, has no material risk that M&E groups will be subject to an ETR on the overall profits of their foreign operations of less than 15%. And then finally, where the inclusive framework determined that a jurisdiction has a qualified side-by-side regime, that jurisdiction will be put on a listed central record like the US is already for the side-by-side package. And then M&E Group can elect for the side-by-side safe harbor for the year starting on or after the 1st of January 2026. If we look at the rest of the side-by-side safe harbor rules, 1.5 on effective dates say the SbS Safe Harbour is applicable for fiscal years commencing on or after the 1st of January. Where a jurisdiction adopts the SbS Safe Harbour into its domestic law after this date, it is expected to do so with retroactive effect, and then they say something to the effect that if you cannot do it with retroactive effect, then you need to do it as soon as possible. And this is not applying for the US only. This is now all the countries that have Pillar 2 legislation need to adopt the Pillar 2 legislation to also encompass the side-by-side safe harbor. And then information reporting on the SbS Safe Harbour. So what would subsidiaries of US multinationals need to do? An M&E group will be able to make the SbS Safe Harbour election in the Globe Information Return in a field that will be added to Section 1. An M&E group which makes the SbS Safe Harbour election will provide only Section 1 of the Globe Information Return to that jurisdiction and is not required to complete Section 1.4. Now, this is great news for US M&E subsidiaries. It then does go on to say in paragraph 30, the SbS Safe Harbour does not affect the reporting obligation for fiscal years commencing before 1 January 2026. So in other words, these M&Es will need to make all the normal Pillar 2 and Globe returns for 24 and 25 just like everyone else does. Thus, an M&E group that makes the SbS Safe Harbour election will provide any QDMTT jurisdiction with Section 1 of the Globe Information Return and then the jurisdictional section for that jurisdiction. Now, I'm not quite sure what the jurisdictional section for that jurisdiction is, but I do believe that at the end of the day, when you are in the SbS Safe Harbour, you basically have to fill in Section 1 for your Pillar 2 compliance. To give you an impression of how much compliance this safe harbor saves you, look at the two boxes here. You can see the green box is the SbS Safe Harbour. So you would need to fill in these 4 pages of the Globe Information Return, and you do not even have to fill in the very bottom of the 4th page. If you are in a normal Pillar 2 Safe Harbour, you need to fill in everything that US M&Es need to do, and you need to fill in at least the next 4 pages on the transitional jurisdictional safe harbors and the permanent safe harbors. And you might even have to fill in additional information on the substance-based income exclusion in terms of your assets and your payroll in order to make use of the substance-based income exclusion if you use the routine profits safe harbor. Now, if you are neither in the side-by-side safe harbor or the Pillar 2 safe harbors, these are potentially all the pages that you need to fill in for the normal Globe Information Return. I say potentially because most of these will not apply. There are 26 adjustments to your final income to get to your globe income calculation. For most groups in most of the countries where they operate, you're never going to do more than 2, maybe 3 of those adjustments. But this gives you an idea of how big the compliance burden jumps from a Pillar 2 and a side-by-side safe harbor to a fully fledged globe information return, or a globe information return where you don't have a QDMTT safe harbor QDMTT, but you have a creditable QDMTT. For instance, because your QDMTT has a switch off clause which applies to your M&E because there is an investment entity in a particular jurisdiction. And then for something quite perverse, if you are in a US-MNE and you enjoy the side-by-side safe harbor, you still need to do your local country QDMTTs. Now, they're not as big as a globe information return compliance burden, but if you are not under any of the Pillar 2 safe harbors in those countries, you still need to fill in everything that applies on a country level. So approximately 2/3 of the globe information return compliance burden still applies for your QDMTT. So the compliance burden itself ultimately is not lifted that much even when you are in a side-by-side safe harbor, because the QDMTT need to follow the globe information return rules. It wouldn't surprise me if a number of countries, which especially if they have primarily US inward investment as opposed to European inward investment, might ultimately decide, you know what, we don't want this QDMTT complexity. What we will do is we will simply increase our own domestic tax rates under our own domestic systems and keep the compliance burden much, much less than what we see here under the globe rules. Now, just for the sake of clarity, I'm not saying that every QDMTT is going to have to require all these boxes to be filled in. It will still be so that in 80 to 90% of the countries, you will run out on one of the safe harbors and the QDMTT will probably be stuck to sections 1 and 2 because you can choose the transitional CbCR safe harbors in most of the QDMTT countries. But for those 10%, 15% where you are not in such a safe harbor, you more or less have to do the full globe return, but then only for the national level, not the cross-border taxes. And then finally there is the UPE Safe Harbour. Now if we look at what the guidelines themselves say, it says the UPE Safe Harbour applies for fiscal years commencing on or after 1 January 2026 and effectively replaces the transitional UTPR Safe Harbour, which expires at the end of 2025. Now what is interesting is I'm not sure if this is an explanation of the 2025 UTPR as well or not, or whether these rules are completely standing by themselves, but the rules do look a lot like the rules for the SbS system. There is a 20% minimum tax, there is a 15% AMT, there is that there's no material risk of going below the ETR of 15%, and then it applies from 1 January 2026. And what it does is it says that the ultimate parent entity cannot be subject to UTPR by itself, not the group, by itself. And obviously the IIR is not relevant for the UPE because there is no shareholder above the UPE, and I'm forgetting for the time being here the tax transparent UPEs from Chapter 7 of the Globe Rules. So just to summarize the differences between the SbS Safe Harbour and UTPR Safe Harbour. The SbS Safe Harbour shield applies to the UPE and to all of its subsidiaries worldwide, and it protects them from the IIR and the UTPR regimes because they've got the alternative regime, such as GILTI in the case of the US. The UPE UTPR Safe Harbour only shields the UPE, and it only shields it obviously from the UTPR because, as we just said, there should be no application of the IIR unless you are transparent. And then how would this apply in real life? If you are a US multinational, you will have the SbS Safe Harbour. You do not need the UPE UTPR after 2025, but you do still need it for 2025, and 2024 do not have a UTPR. And your worldwide subs would not be subject to the IIR or the UTPR because they would be subject to QDMTT and GILTI. However, if you are an Indian UPE or a Chinese UPE which do not have an SbS Safe Harbour yet, then only the UPE in China or in India will be protected against the UTPR, but all the worldwide subs will still be subject to IIR and UTPR worldwide. So if a Chinese entity has an under-tax or low-tax constituent entity which is held directly by China, but it also has a European sister company or sister companies, then those sister companies will be levying the top-up tax under the UTPR, even if the Chinese parent itself is protected. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will also look at the permanent safe harbors. I am much less positive about those than about the SbS system, but more about that later.